When heroes walked the earth, picture this. A time when mead halls echoed with the songs of warriors, when monsters stalked the night, and when a single hero could change the fate of kingdoms with nothing but courage, strength, and an unbreakable will. This is the world of Beowulf, the oldest surviving epic poem in English literature. A story so powerful it has inspired everything from modern superhero movies to tales of knights and dragons for over 1,000 years. But here's what makes this ancient tale absolutely fascinating. It's not just about a guy fighting monsters. It's the ultimate exploration of what makes someone truly heroic, what we owe to our communities, and how we face the inevitable truth that even the mightiest heroes must eventually confront their own mortality. From whichever country you're watching this, you've probably grown up with stories of heroes who risk everything to protect others. But I want you to think about this as we dive into Beowulf's world. What do you think separates a true hero from just someone who's really good at fighting? Is it the monsters they defeat, or something deeper about their character? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're about to journey back to 6th century Scandinavia, to a world where loyalty meant everything, where honor was worth more than life itself, and where the line between the human and supernatural worlds was razor thin. This is the story of 3 epic battles that defined not just one man's legacy, but our entire understanding of what it means to be heroic. The Curse of Heorot. Before Beowulf ever set foot in Denmark, King Hrothgar ruled over the Danes from his magnificent mead hall called Heorot. This wasn't just any building. It was the heart of Danish civilization, a golden palace where warriors gathered to feast, where poets sang of great deeds, and where the bonds of loyalty that held society together were forged over cups of mead and tales of valor. For 12 long winters, Heorot had been the pride of the Danish kingdom, its walls echoing with laughter, music, and the boisterous celebrations of a people at peace. But all of that changed the night the monster came. Grendel, a creature so terrible that even hardened warriors couldn't speak his name without trembling, emerged from the misty moors that surrounded the kingdom. Part giant, part demon, part something far worse than either, Grendel was said to be descended from Cain himself, bearing the mark of the first murderer and carrying within his twisted form all the rage and jealousy that had driven humanity's first act of violence. What drove Grendel to attack Heorot? The saga tells us it was the sound of joy itself, the music, the laughter, the celebration of human fellowship that filled the monster with such unbearable rage that he could no longer remain in the darkness. Night after night, he would wait until the warriors fell asleep in their mead hall, then creep in like death itself to slaughter them in their beds. The first attack left 30 warriors dead, their bodies torn apart with a savagery that defied description. But this was only the beginning. Night after night, Grendel returned, turning Heorot from a symbol of civilization into a house of horror. The great hall that had once been the beating heart of Danish culture stood empty after sunset, its benches stained with blood, its walls echoing with the ghosts of the slaughtered. King Hrothgar, once proud and mighty, found himself powerless against this supernatural threat. His warriors, brave men who had faced human enemies without flinching, discovered that all their weapons were useless against Grendel's hide. Their swords couldn't cut him, their spears couldn't pierce him, and their shields couldn't protect them from claws that could tear through mail and bone as if they were parchment. Here's something that really strikes me about this part of the story. Imagine being a warrior in that time, when your entire identity was built around protecting your people, and suddenly facing an enemy that makes all your skills meaningless. From whatever culture you're from, you probably have stories about times when conventional solutions didn't work, when people had to find new ways to face unprecedented challenges. What do you think communities should do when traditional methods fail? Share your thoughts below. For 12 years, an entire generation, this terror continued. The Danes tried everything. They offered sacrifices to their old gods. They consulted wise men and sages. They even attempted to negotiate with the monster. Nothing worked. Grendel seemed to exist for the sole purpose of destroying human joy and fellowship, as if he was the physical manifestation of everything dark and antisocial in the world. The psychological impact on Danish society was devastating. Warriors who had once competed for the honor of sleeping in Heorot now avoided the hall entirely. Young men grew up never knowing what it was like to feast in safety, and the bonds that held the warrior culture together began to fray under the constant threat of supernatural death. But across the Whale Road, in the land of the Geats, a young warrior heard of Hrothgar's plight. Beowulf was no ordinary fighter. He was said to have the strength of 30 men in his grip, to be able to swim for days in full armor, and to have never lost a battle or competition. More importantly, he possessed something that had become rare in those dark times, the unshakable conviction that evil could be defeated by those brave enough to face it. When Beowulf announced his intention to sail to Denmark and face Grendel, even his own king had doubts. This wasn't their fight. The Geats had their own problems to worry about. But Beowulf understood something that many modern audiences miss. In the warrior culture of the early medieval world, reputation and honor weren't just personal qualities. They were the currency that held society together. A warrior who turned away from the chance to help others and prove his worth wasn't just a coward. He was a failure as a human being. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become the stuff of legend. A monster who had terrorized an entire kingdom for 12 years was about to face a hero who had never known defeat. But the real question wasn't whether Beowulf could win. It was what his victory would cost him, and whether any mortal man could truly defeat the forces of chaos and darkness that Grendel represented. The arrival of the hero when Beowulf's ship appeared on the Danish coast, cutting through the gray waters of the North Sea like a blade through silk, the very sight of it stirred hope in hearts that had known only fear for 12 long years. The ship itself was a masterwork of Geatish craftsmanship, its prow carved with fierce dragon heads, its sail bearing the symbols of warriors who had never known defeat in battle. But it wasn't the ship that impressed the Danish coast guards. It was the man who stood at its prow. Beowulf was tall even by the standards of that age of giants, his golden hair and beard gleaming in the northern sun, his hand resting casually on the pommel of a sword that had tasted the blood of monsters and men alike. When he spoke to the guards who challenged his landing, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had never doubted his own ability to overcome any obstacle. "I am Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, prince of the Geats," he announced, his words carrying across the water with the authority of thunder. "I have come to face the creature that stalks your night, to end the curse that has fallen upon Heorot, and to restore the joy that darkness has stolen from your people." The coast guards, hardened men who had seen 12 years of horror, found themselves daring to hope for the first time in their adult lives. There was something about this foreign prince that spoke of possibilities they had forgotten existed. The possibility that monsters could be defeated, that heroes still walked the earth, and that the long nightmare of Grendel's reign might finally be coming to an end. The journey from the coast to Hrothgar's court became a procession of growing excitement as word spread that a hero had come to challenge the monster. Farmers left their fields, craftsmen abandoned their workshops, and even hardened warriors who had given up hope emerged from hiding to catch a glimpse of the man who claimed he could do what no Dane had been able to accomplish. King Hrothgar's reception of Beowulf revealed the complex emotions of a proud ruler who had been humbled by forces beyond his control. On one hand, he was grateful that anyone was willing to help his people. On the other hand, the fact that a foreign prince had to solve a problem that his own warriors couldn't address was a source of deep shame and embarrassment. But Hrothgar was wise enough to recognize that pride was a luxury his people could no longer afford. He welcomed Beowulf with all the honor due to a visiting prince, but also with the desperate gratitude of a man who had watched his kingdom slowly dying for over a decade. The feast that night in Heorot was unlike any the hall had seen since Grendel's first attack. For one evening, the specter of the monster seemed to retreat as warriors from two kingdoms shared mead and stories, as poets sang of ancient heroes, and as the bonds of fellowship that had been strained to breaking point were renewed and strengthened by the presence of genuine hope. Here's what I find absolutely fascinating about this moment. Beowulf doesn't just show up and immediately fight the monster. He participates in the social rituals. He honors the customs of his hosts. He builds relationships with the Danish warriors. True heroism, the story suggests, isn't just about individual strength. It's about understanding how to function within a community and inspire others. Think about heroes from your own culture or modern times. Don't the best ones also know how to bring people together? What qualities do you think make someone not just strong, but truly heroic? But even as the celebration continued, everyone knew that when darkness fell, the real test would begin. Grendel had never failed to appear when warriors slept in Heorot, and there was no reason to believe that one more sword arm, however strong, would make a difference where so many others had failed. Beowulf's announcement of his strategy shocked everyone who heard it. He would face Grendel without weapons or armor, meeting the monster with nothing but his bare hands and his own strength. To the Danes, this seemed like suicide. Their best warriors with the finest weapons had been slaughtered like sheep. How could an unarmed man, however strong, hope to succeed where armed and armored veterans had failed? But Beowulf understood something that his hosts had missed. Grendel's invulnerability to weapons wasn't just a supernatural ability. It was part of his essential nature as a creature of chaos and darkness. To defeat such a monster, one had to meet it on its own terms, with primal strength rather than civilized tools, with natural courage rather than manufactured protection. As night fell and the other warriors retreated to safer quarters, Beowulf and his chosen companions settled into Heorot to wait for the monster. The hero lay down on one of the benches, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. Every sense was alert, every muscle was ready, as he prepared for a confrontation that would either end his life or establish his reputation for all time. The stage was set for the most famous monster fight in all of literature, a battle that would determine not just the fate of the Danish kingdom, but the future of heroic poetry itself. In the darkness outside Heorot, something ancient and evil was stirring, preparing for what it assumed would be just another night of easy slaughter. But this time, the monster would discover that not all men were helpless prey. Some were predators themselves. The battle in the darkness. Midnight came to Heorot like a living thing, thick with mist that seemed to carry whispers of ancient malice. The great hall, which had echoed with celebration just hours before, now lay in perfect silence, except for the carefully controlled breathing of Beowulf and his companions. Outside, something was moving through the darkness, something massive and terrible that made no sound as it approached, but left a trail of wrongness in the air that made even brave men shiver. Grendel's approach to the hall was unlike anything the surviving witnesses would ever forget. The monster moved with the fluid grace of a nightmare made flesh, his enormous form somehow managing to remain silent despite his size. When he reached the great doors of Heorot, doors that had been reinforced with iron bands and blessed by priests, he tore them from their hinges as easily as a child might pluck petals from a flower. The first Geatish warrior never had a chance to scream. Grendel was upon him in an instant, claws that could rend steel tearing through flesh and bone with sickening ease. The monster's feeding was horrific to witness. Not the clean kill of a natural predator, but the savage gorging of something that hated the very concept of human life and took pleasure in destroying it as messily as possible. But as Grendel reached for his second victim, something unprecedented happened. A hand closed around his wrist, a human hand that gripped with such strength that for the first time in over a century, the monster found his movement constrained by mortal strength. Beowulf had made his move. The shock on Grendel's face, or what passed for a face on that twisted mockery of human form, would have been comical if the situation weren't so terrifying. For 12 years, he had slaughtered warriors without any meaningful resistance. Now, suddenly, he found himself in the grip of something that matched his supernatural strength with purely human determination. The battle that followed was unlike anything ever recorded in the annals of heroic literature. This wasn't the elegant swordplay of courtly romances or the tactical maneuvering of military campaigns. This was primal combat in its purest form. Two beings of immense power locked in a struggle that would end only when one of them was dead. The hall shook as the combatants crashed into walls and pillars, as benches were reduced to splinters and ancient treasures were destroyed in the fury of their conflict. Grendel discovered that his claws, which could tear through the finest armor, couldn't penetrate skin hardened by a lifetime of battle and strengthened by unshakable will. Beowulf found that even his legendary strength was barely sufficient to match the supernatural power of his enemy. Here's what makes this fight so compelling to audiences across centuries and cultures. It's not about fancy weapons or magical abilities. It's about two forces of nature colliding, about human determination facing down inhuman malice. Every culture has stories like this, whether it's David facing Goliath or folk heroes battling demons. What do you think it is about these bare-handed battles against impossible odds that speaks to something deep in the human spirit? I'd love to hear about similar stories from your culture in the comments. The turning point came when Beowulf realized that Grendel, for all his supernatural power, had one very human weakness: fear. The monster had terrorized others for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. Now, facing an opponent who not only matched his strength but showed no sign of fear, Grendel began to panic. In that moment of panic, the monster made his fatal mistake. He tried to flee, to escape back to his lair in the misty moors where he could lick his wounds and plan another attack. But Beowulf's grip was unbreakable, forged from years of training and strengthened by absolute determination to end the terror that had plagued the Danish people. What happened next became the stuff of legend. As Grendel struggled to escape, as he threw all his supernatural strength against the human grip that held him, something inside his body began to give way. The arm that Beowulf held, the same arm that had torn apart hundreds of warriors, began to separate from the monster's shoulder, sinew by sinew, bone by bone. The sound of Grendel's death scream was heard for miles across the Danish countryside, a howl of pain and fury and disbelief that spoke of a creature who had never imagined that his reign of terror could end. As the monster's arm tore completely away from his body, as his lifeblood poured onto the floor of Heorot, Grendel stumbled into the night, leaving a trail of gore that would lead back to his lair, where he would die alone and unmourned. Beowulf stood in the ruined hall, holding the monster's arm like a grotesque trophy, his body covered in Grendel's black blood but otherwise unharmed. The silence that followed the monster's departure was different from the terrified quiet that had dominated Heorot for 12 years. This was the silence of awe, of disbelief, of joy so overwhelming that it couldn't immediately find words. When dawn broke and the Danish warriors dared to return to their hall, they found Beowulf calmly cleaning Grendel's blood from his hands while the monster's severed arm hung from the rafters as proof that the impossible had been accomplished. The curse of Heorot was broken. The terror that had defined an entire generation was ended, and the Age of Heroes had proved that it was not yet finished. But as the celebrations began, and the Danish people prepared to honor their deliverer with gifts and praise beyond measure, none of them realized that killing Grendel had been only the first battle in a war that was far from over. In the depths of her underwater lair, something even more terrible than Grendel was learning of her son's death and beginning to plan a revenge that would test Beowulf's heroism even more severely than his first victory had. The mother's revenge. The celebration that followed Grendel's defeat lasted for days, as Danish warriors who had lived in fear for 12 years finally dared to believe that their nightmare was truly over. Hrothgar showered Beowulf with gifts: gold-hilted swords, precious armor, horses with golden bridles, and treasures beyond counting. Poets composed songs about the hero's victory that would be sung in mead halls for generations to come. But the joy was premature. Grendel's mother had dwelt in the dark waters of a cursed mere for longer than human memory could reach, nursing ancient grudges and perfecting supernatural powers that made her son's abilities seem almost trivial by comparison. Where Grendel had been savage and brutal, she was calculating and intelligent. Where he had killed for the pleasure of destruction, she would kill for the more focused purpose of revenge. The night after the great celebration, as the Danes slept peacefully in Heorot for the first time in over a decade, Grendel's mother rose from her underwater hall like a nightmare-given form. She moved through the darkness with predatory grace, her ancient intelligence guiding her toward a vengeance that would hurt her enemies far more than random slaughter ever could. Her target wasn't the foreign hero who had killed her son. That would be too obvious, too simple. Instead, she struck at the heart of Danish society itself, seizing Aeschere, King Hrothgar's most trusted advisor and closest friend, a man whose wisdom and loyalty had helped hold the kingdom together through the darkest years of Grendel's terror. When morning came and Aeschere's bloody remains were discovered in the hall, the message was unmistakably clear. Grendel's mother was announcing that she was nothing like her crude and straightforward son. She would not be content with random violence. She wanted sophisticated revenge that would force her enemies to understand exactly what they had lost and what they still stood to lose. The psychological impact of this new attack was devastating in ways that Grendel's straightforward terrorism had never been. The Danes had begun to believe that monsters could be defeated, that heroes could triumph, that the natural order could be restored through courage and strength. Now they faced the horrifying possibility that victory might be temporary, that killing one monster might only summon something worse, and that their celebration had been nothing more than a brief respite before an even greater horror. King Hrothgar's grief over Aeschere's death revealed the depth of bonds that held the warrior. Culture together. This wasn't just the loss of an advisor, but the murder of a brother in all but blood. A man who had stood by the king through every crisis and whose wisdom had been instrumental in keeping the Danish kingdom functioning during the years of terror. But Hrothgar's request that Beowulf hunt down and destroy this new threat posed challenges that went far beyond anything the hero had faced in his battle with Grendel. The monster's mother didn't live in accessible places where human warriors could confront her on equal terms. Her lair lay at the bottom of a supernatural mere whose dark waters were said to be cursed, where even the bravest swimmers would drown before reaching the depths where she dwelt in her underwater hall. Here's what I find so compelling about this part of the story. It shows us that solving one problem often creates new ones, that victory can be temporary if we don't address root causes. Every generation faces this challenge, whether it's in personal struggles or global conflicts. You defeat one enemy only to discover they had allies you didn't know about. From your own experience or your culture's history, can you think of examples where solving one problem led to unexpected new challenges? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Beowulf's acceptance of this new quest demonstrated a level of heroic commitment that went beyond simple courage or desire for glory. He could have reasonably argued that he had fulfilled his promise to the Danes, that killing Grendel had been sufficient service, and that pursuing the monster's mother into her underwater domain was asking too much of any mortal hero. Instead, he recognized that true heroism required seeing tasks through to their completion. understanding that half measures in the face of evil often led to even greater disasters later. If Grendel's mother was allowed to survive and plot her revenge, she might eventually pose an even greater threat than her son had ever been. The journey to the Cursed Mere took Beowulf and a small band of the bravest Danish and Geatish warriors through landscapes that seemed to exist at the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. The Mere itself was a place of such obvious evil that even hardened warriors hesitated to approach its shores, where the water bubbled with unnatural heat, and strange creatures surfaced briefly before diving back into depths that no living man had ever explored. The decision to descend alone into those hellish waters represented perhaps the greatest act of courage in all of heroic literature. Beowulf was choosing to enter a realm where all his advantages as a human warrior would be stripped away, where he would face an enemy on her own terms in her own domain, with no possibility of retreat or assistance if things went wrong. As he prepared for the descent, accepting a magical sword from the Danish warriors and donning armor that had never failed to protect its wearer, Beowulf understood that he was embarking on a journey from which he might never return. But the alternative, allowing evil to fester and grow in the depths while innocent people suffered above, was unacceptable to someone who had dedicated his life to the service of justice and the protection of the innocent. The stage was set for a battle that would take place in the most alien environment imaginable, where a human hero would face a creature of ancient evil in her own underwater kingdom, with the fate of two nations hanging in the balance and no guarantee that good would triumph over evil in the end. Into the depths of hell, the descent into the cursed Mere was like diving into the very mouth of hell itself. The dark waters closed over Beowulf's head with an almost intelligent malice, as if the Mere itself were a living entity that resented the intrusion of anything pure or heroic. For what seemed like hours, he sank through layers of increasingly foul water, past creatures that should not exist, and through depths that defied natural law. The water itself seemed to be alive with malevolent purpose, clutching at the hero, with currents that tried to drag him away from his intended path, filling his mouth and nose with tastes of corruption and decay that spoke of centuries of accumulated evil. Strange lights flickered in the depths, not the clean illumination of sun or fire, but the sickly phosphorescence of things that had never been touched by wholesome light. As Beowulf descended deeper than any mortal had ever ventured, he began to encounter the guardians of Grendel's mother's realm, creatures that were part fish, part serpent, part nightmare, beings that attacked with the focused hatred of things that existed only to destroy anything good or clean that dared to enter their domain. His sword sang through the dark water as he fought his way downward, each stroke clearing a path through enemies that multiplied like the heads of a hydra. The underwater hall that finally appeared in the murky depths was a masterwork of supernatural architecture. Its walls built from materials that had never seen the surface world, illuminated by fires that burned without consuming and decorated with the bones of countless victims who had been dragged down over the centuries. This was Grendel's mother's throne room, her court, her seat of power in a kingdom that existed in the spaces between life and death. Grendel's mother herself was a revelation that challenged everything Beowulf thought he understood about the nature of evil. Where her son had been crude and bestial, she possessed an ancient intelligence that spoke of centuries spent perfecting her hatred and planning her revenge. Where Grendel had been powerful but essentially simple, she wielded supernatural abilities that had been refined through ages of practice and study. The battle that erupted in that underwater hall transcended anything that had ever been recorded in the annals of heroic literature. This wasn't just physical combat, but a clash between different orders of existence: mortal determination facing immortal malice, human courage confronting supernatural evil, the temporary strength of flesh and bone standing against powers that had endured since the dawn of time. Beowulf's trusted sword, which had never failed him in battle, shattered against the monster's hide like glass against stone, leaving him weaponless in the depths of her domain, with no possibility of retreat or escape. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, it appeared that his heroic career would end in the darkness beneath the mere, that his bones would join the countless others that decorated the walls of this hellish hall. But it was at this moment of greatest peril that Beowulf discovered what separated true heroes from mere warriors. When his weapons failed and his strength seemed insufficient, when death appeared certain and defeat inevitable, he found within himself reserves of determination that transcended physical capability and entered the realm of pure will. Here's something profound about this moment that speaks to struggles we all face. Sometimes our usual tools and methods aren't enough. Sometimes we have to dig deeper than we ever thought possible and find strength we didn't know we had. Whether it's facing personal crises, professional challenges, or defending principles we believe in, we all encounter moments when everything we've relied on fails us. What do you think separates people who find a way to continue from those who give up? Share your thoughts about times when you or someone you know found unexpected strength. His salvation came from an unexpected source, an ancient sword hanging on the wall of the hall, a weapon forged by giants in the early days of the EC world when supernatural craftsmanship could create blades that would never dull and never break. This sword, waiting in the monster's own treasury, became the instrument of her destruction, as if fate itself had placed it there for this moment of ultimate confrontation. The killing stroke that finally ended Grendel's mother's reign of terror was delivered with a weapon created by her own kind, powered by human determination, but enabled by supernatural craftsmanship. The irony was perfect. Evil destroyed by its own tools, wielded by someone pure enough to turn weapons of darkness toward the service of light. But even in death, Grendel's mother provided one final revelation. As her body dissolved in the cursed waters of her own hall, the supernatural fires that had illuminated her domain began to dim, and in the growing darkness, Beowulf discovered the corpse of Grendel himself, brought here by his mother after his death to rest in the only place that had ever been home to their cursed line. Using the giant sword that had killed the mother, Beowulf severed Grendel's head as final proof of his victory and ultimate token of the Danish people's liberation from the terror that had defined their lives for so long. But as he did so, the supernatural blade began to dissolve, its metal melting away like ice in summer heat until only the hilt remained, as if the weapon's purpose had been fulfilled and it no longer needed to exist. The ascent from the depths was a journey from hell back to the world of the living, from the realm of nightmares to the domain of hope and possibility. When Beowulf finally surfaced in the mere, gasping for breath and bearing the head of Grendel as proof of his incredible victory, the Danish and Geatish warriors who had waited feared the worst. He had been underwater so long that many had given up hope and begun to prepare funeral songs. But their joy at his survival was matched by their awe at what he had accomplished. Not only had he killed Grendel's mother in her own domain, but he had ended the threat that the cursed bloodline might continue to terrorize future generations. The nightmare that had begun with Grendel's first attack on Heorot was finally, completely, absolutely finished. The hero's reward and departure. The return to Heorot with Grendel's massive head required 4 of the strongest warriors to carry, and its arrival in the Great Hall created a scene of celebration that surpassed even the joy that had followed the monster's initial defeat. Here was proof beyond any doubt that both creatures were dead, that the curse that had plagued the Danish people was broken not just temporarily, but permanently, and that they could finally rebuild their lives without the shadow of supernatural terror hanging over every moment of their existence. King Hrothgar's gratitude transcended the normal bounds of royal generosity, as he showered Beowulf with treasures that represented not just wealth, but the accumulated symbols of Danish power and prestige. Golden arm rings, jeweled swords, precious chalices, fine horses, and most significantly, a magnificent torque that had belonged to Hrothgar's own ancestors. These gifts were more than payment for services rendered. They were recognition that Beowulf had earned a place among the greatest heroes in the history of the northern peoples. But perhaps more valuable than any material reward were the words of wisdom that the aged king shared with his young savior. Advice born from decades of ruling and the hard-won understanding of how power, fame, and fortune could corrupt even the most heroic individuals if they weren't approached with proper humility and perspective. Hrothgar's speech to Beowulf became one of the most quoted passages in all of Anglo-Saxon literature, a meditation on the responsibilities that come with great ability and the dangers that await those who begin to believe their own legends. The old king had seen too many promising young warriors destroyed not by monsters or enemies, but by their own pride and arrogance. And he wanted to ensure that Denmark's deliverer wouldn't fall victim to the same spiritual corruption that had claimed so many others. Remember what your strength is for, Hrothgar counseled, and understand that the greatest enemy any hero will ever face is not some external monster, but the darkness that can grow within his own heart if he forgets that. His gifts are meant to serve others rather than glorify himself. The wisdom of these words would prove prophetic in ways that neither king nor hero could foresee, as Beowulf's future would indeed be shaped by how well he heeded this advice about the proper use of power and the importance of remaining connected to the communities and principles that gave heroism its meaning. The departure from Denmark was bittersweet for all involved, as the Danes were saying goodbye to their deliverer, while the Geats were welcoming home a hero whose reputation would bring honor to their people for generations to come. The ship that carried Beowulf and his companions back across the Whale Road was heavy with Danish gold, but even heavier with the weight of accomplished duty and the satisfaction that comes from knowing that one's life has been dedicated to worthy purposes. Here's something that really resonates about Beowulf's character at this point in the story. He doesn't stay in Denmark to be worshipped as a hero or to claim any kind of permanent reward for his deeds. He goes home to serve his own people, understanding that heroism is about service rather than personal glory. Throughout history, the greatest leaders have been those who remain connected to their communities rather than being seduced by fame and adulation. What do you think keeps successful people humble and focused on service? Can you think of examples from your own culture of leaders who stayed true to their roots despite achieving great things? The homecoming in Geatland was a triumph that established Beowulf as the greatest warrior of his generation and the natural successor to his uncle King Hygelac when the time came for new leadership. The treasures he had won in Denmark were distributed among his followers and kinsmen according to the generous customs of warrior culture, demonstrating that his heroism extended beyond individual combat to encompass the social responsibilities that defined true nobility. But the young hero who returned from Denmark was subtly different from the eager warrior who had first sailed across the North Sea to face unknown dangers. The battles with Grendel and his mother had taught him things about the nature of evil and the responsibilities of power that couldn't be learned in any other way, and these lessons would shape his approach to leadership in the years to come. The period that followed Beowulf's return was one of peace and prosperity for the Geatish people, as their hero's reputation protected them from enemies who might otherwise have tested their strength, while his wisdom and counsel helped guide the kingdom toward policies that promoted the welfare of all rather than just the warrior elite who typically dominated such decisions. When King Hygelac died in battle during a raid that went disastrously wrong, the natural succession that brought Beowulf to the throne was welcomed by a people who had come to understand that their hero possessed not just the strength to defeat enemies, but the judgment necessary to lead them wisely in times both of war and peace. For 50 years, Beowulf ruled the Geats with a combination of strength and wisdom that made his reign legendary throughout the northern world. His kingdom prospered, his people lived in security, and his name became synonymous with the kind of leadership that put the welfare of the community above the ambitions of the ruler. But as the old saying warns, the sins of youth are paid for in age, and even the greatest heroes must eventually face challenges that test not just their strength, but their willingness to sacrifice everything they have built for the principles they have always served. The peaceful decades of Beowulf's reign were about to be shattered by the awakening of an enemy that would make even Grendel and his mother seem like manageable threats. A dragon whose fury would test the aging hero's courage one final, fatal time. The dragon's awakening. 50 years of peace had made the Geats prosperous and proud, but it had also made them complacent. A generation had grown up knowing only security, protected by their king's reputation and the wisdom of his rule, never imagining that the golden age of Beowulf's reign might eventually come to an end. The young warriors who served in his hall had never faced the kind of supernatural terror that had defined their king's youth, and their courage remained untested against enemies that transcended normal human understanding. But deep beneath a barrow on the cliffs overlooking the sea, something ancient and terrible had been sleeping for 300 years, guarding a treasure hoard that represented the accumulated wealth of a long-dead people. The dragon that coiled around this fortune was no mere beast, but a supernatural force of greed and destruction, a creature whose very existence was tied to the protection of gold, and whose fury, once awakened, could devastate entire kingdoms. The catastrophe began with a single act of desperate theft. A slave, fleeing his master's wrath and seeking some prize that might buy his freedom, stumbled upon the dragon's barrow and crept inside while the great serpent slept. In the glittering darkness, surrounded by treasures beyond his wildest dreams, he selected what seemed like a relatively modest prize, a single golden cup, beautifully crafted but apparently no different from dozens of others scattered throughout the hoard. But to the dragon, every piece of its treasure was as precious as life itself. Each golden coin and jeweled ornament counted and recounted over the centuries, until the creature knew its hoard more intimately than most people know their own children. The theft of even one cup was a violation so profound that it shattered the dragon's centuries-long sleep and filled its ancient heart with rage that burned hotter than the fires of its breath. The dragon's response to this theft was swift and terrible. Rising from its barrow like a living volcano, the creature took to the skies above Geatland, seeking not just the thief, but revenge against the entire human world that had dared to disturb its eternal vigilance. Its fiery breath reduced farmsteads to ash, its claws tore apart carefully built halls, and its roar struck terror into hearts that had known only peace for half a century. Night after night, the dragon's attacks continued, each sortie from its cliff-top lair bringing fresh devastation to the Geatish countryside. The creature seemed to take particular pleasure in destroying the works of human civilization. The halls where communities gathered, the farms where families made their livings, the roads and bridges that connected isolated settlements into a functioning kingdom. But the attack that finally drove King Beowulf to action was the most personal of all. The dragon, perhaps sensing where the greatest concentration of human achievement lay, turned its fury upon the royal hall itself, reducing to ashes in a single night the magnificent building where Beowulf had ruled for 50 years, where his warriors had gathered to hear tales of ancient heroes, and where the bonds of loyalty that held Geatish society together had been forged and maintained. Standing in the smoking ruins of his life's work, surrounded by the charred remains of treasures that had represented not just wealth, but the accumulated symbols of his people's prosperity and culture, the aged king understood that this was more than just another monster to be defeated. This was a test of everything he had learned about leadership, duty, and the price that heroes must sometimes pay to protect those who depend on them. Here's what makes this moment so powerful and relevant to every generation. Beowulf is no longer the young warrior eager for glory who had sailed to Denmark decades earlier. He's now an old man, a king with responsibilities, someone who has everything to lose and who knows that facing this dragon will likely cost him his life. Yet he chooses to fight anyway, because that's what heroes do when their people need them. Throughout history, we see this same pattern. Leaders who risk everything when duty calls, even when they're past their prime. What do you think drives people to make these sacrifices? Can you think of examples from your own culture of leaders who put their people's welfare above their own safety? Beowulf's decision to face the dragon alone, despite the protests of his younger warriors and the obvious risks involved, reflected both the warrior code that had shaped his entire life and his understanding that some responsibilities couldn't be delegated to others no matter how willing they might be to share the danger. But age and wisdom had also taught him practical lessons that his younger self might have ignored. Unlike his battles with Grendel and his mother, which had relied primarily on strength and courage, the confrontation with the dragon would require careful preparation, superior equipment, and tactical planning that took into account both his own limitations as an aging warrior and the supernatural abilities of his enemy. The iron shield that his smiths crafted specifically for this battle represented the best of Geatish metalwork, designed to withstand the dragon's fiery breath while remaining light enough for an old man to carry into combat. The sword he chose was not the fanciest in his collection, but the most reliable, a blade that had served him faithfully through decades of smaller conflicts and whose balance he knew as intimately as his own heartbeat. Most importantly, he selected 11 of his most trusted warriors to accompany him to the dragon's barrow, men whose loyalty had been tested over years of service and whose courage he could depend upon when facing the most dangerous enemy of his long career. Among them was Wiglaf, a young warrior whose devotion to his king would soon be tested in ways that would define his own place in the halls of heroic legend. The journey to the dragon's lair became a pilgrimage of sorts, as Beowulf reflected on the long path that had brought him from eager young hero to aged king, facing his final battle. The cliffs that rose ahead of them, smoke-wreathed and terrible in their ancient majesty, seemed to represent not just a geographical destination, but the culmination of a lifetime spent in service to ideals that demanded the ultimate sacrifice, when the moment of truth finally arrived. As they approached the barrow where the dragon waited, coiled around its treasure like a living curse upon the very concept of human ambition, Beowulf understood that he was walking toward his own death. But he also understood that some things were more important than individual survival, and that the heroic tradition he represented demanded that he face this final test with the same courage he had shown as a young man, regardless of what it might cost him personally. The stage was set for the most famous death scene in all of Anglo-Saxon literature, a battle that would test not just physical courage, but the deeper question of what legacy a hero leaves behind when his strength finally fails and his mortality catches up with his legendary reputation. The final battle. The dragon's barrow rose from the cliff top like a monument to ancient greed, its entrance yawning wide as a gateway to hell itself. Smoke poured from the opening in thick, choking clouds that spoke of fires that had burned for centuries, while the very stones of the structure seemed to radiate malevolence that made even the bravest warriors reluctant to approach too closely. Beowulf's speech to his companions before entering the barrow became one of the most moving passages in all of heroic literature, a meditation on mortality, duty, and the meaning of a life spent in service to others. The aged king spoke not with the boastful confidence of his youth, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen enough of life to understand both its preciousness and its transience. "I have lived through many battles," he told his followers, "and I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear. when action is necessary for the protection of those who depend upon us. Today I go to face a dragon not because I no longer value life, but because I value it so much that I cannot bear to see it destroyed by evil, while I still have strength to resist. The wisdom in these words reflected 50 years of kingship, decades of understanding that true leadership meant being willing to sacrifice oneself for the welfare of others. That heroism in its highest form was not about personal glory, but about service to ideals larger than individual ambition or survival. But, as the moment of confrontation approached, Beowulf's followers began to understand the terrible reality of what their king was asking of them. This wasn't just another battle where courage and skill might triumph over superior numbers or even supernatural strength. This was a suicide mission undertaken by an old man whose body could no longer match his indomitable spirit, and their participation would likely mean sharing his fate without being able to significantly influence the outcome. One by one, as the dragon's roar echoed from the depths of the barrow and the heat of its breath made the very air shimmer with deadly intent, 10 of Beowulf's 11 chosen warriors found reasons to retreat to safer positions. They didn't flee in panic or abandon their king through cowardice, but they made the rational calculation that dying alongside him would serve no useful purpose if it meant leaving their own families and communities unprotected. Only Wiglaf remained, a young warrior whose loyalty to his king transcended rational self-interest, and whose understanding of heroic duty had been shaped by the same ideals that had guided Beowulf throughout his legendary career. His decision to stay and fight beside his aging lord, even when victory seemed impossible and death appeared certain, established him as the inheritor of the heroic tradition that Beowulf represented. The battle with the dragon tested every lesson that Beowulf had learned about combat, leadership, and the relationship between individual heroism and collective survival. The creature that emerged from the barrow was a masterpiece of supernatural terror, its scales harder than the finest armor, its breath hot enough to melt steel, its claws and teeth capable of tearing through stone and metal as if they were parchment. But more dangerous than its physical capabilities was the dragon's ancient intelligence, honed by centuries of guarding its treasure and perfected through encounters with countless heroes who had attempted to claim its gold over the ages. This was no mindless beast, but a strategic opponent who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of human warriors and who had developed tactics specifically designed to counter their advantages. Here's what makes this final battle so different. From Beowulf's earlier triumphs, this time strength and courage aren't enough. Age has weakened his body, experience has taught him the limits of individual heroism, and he faces an enemy that represents not just physical danger, but the accumulated malice of centuries. Yet he fights anyway, because that's what heroes do. Every culture has stories of aging warriors making final stands, of leaders who choose duty over safety when everything they've built is threatened. What do you think this says about the nature of true heroism? Is it more heroic to fight when you're young and strong, or when you're old and know the odds are against you? The initial stages of the battle seemed to confirm the worst fears of those who had counseled against this confrontation. Beowulf's sword, which had served him faithfully through decades of combat, shattered against the dragon's hide, leaving him weaponless in the face of an enemy whose every attack threatened to end not just his life, but the survival of his entire kingdom. The dragon's fire scorched through his iron shield as if it were made of paper, searing his flesh and filling his lungs with smoke that made breathing an agony. For the first time in his legendary career, Beowulf found himself not just outmatched, but seemingly defeated, his strength insufficient to his task, and his weapons inadequate to his enemy. It was at this moment of apparent defeat that Wiglaf proved himself worthy of his place in the heroic tradition. Seeing his king overwhelmed and facing certain death, the young warrior charged into the battle without regard for his own safety, his sword finding gaps in the dragon's armor that Beowulf's experience had revealed, but his failing strength had been unable to exploit. The partnership between aged wisdom and youthful strength that followed represented the passing of heroic tradition from one generation to the next, as Beowulf's final battle became not just his own struggle, but a lesson for the young warrior who would inherit his responsibilities. Together, they wounded the dragon grievously, but the victory came at a price that would reshape the entire future of the Geatish kingdom. Beowulf's mortal wound, delivered by the dragon's venomous bite as he struck the killing blow, marked the end of an era in more ways than the mere death of a king. With his passing, the Geats would lose not just their leader, but their protection against enemies who had been held at bay only by respect for his legendary prowess and fear of his wrath. As he lay dying beside the body of the dragon he had slain, surrounded by the treasure that had cost so many lives to protect and recover, Beowulf's final words revealed his understanding of what heroism ultimately meant and what legacy he hoped to leave behind for future generations to remember and emulate. The hero's legacy. In his final moments, as life ebbed from his body and the treasure of the ancient kings glittered around him in the dragon's barrow, Beowulf's thoughts turned not to his own approaching death, but to the future of the people who had depended on his strength for 50 years. His dying words to Wiglaf carried the weight of a lifetime's wisdom and the urgent necessity of ensuring that his death would not leave the Geats defenseless against the enemies who would inevitably test their strength once word of his passing spread throughout the northern world. "Bring me some of the treasure," he whispered to his faithful companion, "so that I may see with my own eyes what my life has purchased, and know that my death serves some purpose beyond the mere ending of an old warrior's story." The gold and jewels that Wiglaf gathered from the dragon's hoard represented more than mere wealth. They were symbols of the ancient kings who had ruled before the dragon's coming, artifacts of civilizations that had risen and fallen while the great serpent slept upon their accumulated treasures. In handling these precious objects, Beowulf was touching the physical remains of human achievement and ambition, the lasting works that survive long after their creators have returned to dust. But his final instructions to Wiglaf revealed that he understood treasure's true value lay not in its material worth, but in its potential to serve the living. The gold would help the Geats rebuild what the dragon had destroyed, provide resources for defending the kingdom against future threats, and serve as tangible proof that their king's final battle had accomplished something meaningful beyond mere vengeance or personal glory. More importantly, Beowulf's request that his body be burned on a great funeral pyre visible from the sea, with the ashes buried in a barrow that would serve as a landmark for sailors for generations to come, showed his understanding that a hero's most important legacy is not the treasure he accumulates, but the inspiration his example provides to those who come after him. The funeral that followed Beowulf's death became legendary throughout the northern world, a ceremony that honored not just a single king, but the entire heroic tradition he had embodied throughout his life. Warriors came from distant kingdoms to pay their respects, poets composed verses that would be sung for centuries, and the funeral pyre itself burned with such brilliance that ships far out at sea could navigate by its light. But the most moving tribute came from his own people, as the Geats, who had lived under his protection for 50 years, struggled to find words adequate to describe what they had lost and what his example had meant to them. Their songs spoke not just of his strength or his victories over monsters, but of his wisdom as a ruler, his generosity to his followers, and most importantly, his unwavering commitment to placing the welfare of others above his own comfort or safety. The barrow that rose over Beowulf's ashes became more than a monument to a dead king. It became a symbol of what human beings could achieve when they dedicated their lives to ideals larger than personal ambition or individual survival. Sailors passing on the sea below would point to the great mound and tell stories of the hero who lay buried there, ensuring that his example would continue to inspire future generations long after the specific details of his battles had been forgotten. Here's what I think makes Beowulf's legacy so enduring and relevant to every culture and generation. He shows us that true heroism isn't about being invincible or never failing, but about continuing to fight for what's right, even when victory seems impossible and the cost is everything you hold dear. Whether it's in ancient Scandinavia or modern times, whether it's facing literal monsters or the everyday evils that threaten our communities, the same principles apply. What do you think are the most important qualities that make someone truly heroic? And how can we apply Beowulf's example to the challenges we face in our own lives and times? Wiglaf's emergence as Beowulf's successor represented both continuity and change in the heroic tradition. He had proven his courage in the dragon fight, demonstrated his loyalty through his willingness to die beside his king, and inherited the responsibility for protecting a people who had grown accustomed to security under a legendary leader's protection. But Wiglaf also inherited problems that Beowulf's death had created or exacerbated. Neighboring kingdoms that had respected the old king's strength would inevitably test the young ruler's resolve. The dragon's treasure, while providing resources for defense, would also attract attention from those who believed the Geats might be too weak to protect their new wealth. Most challenging of all, he had to lead a people who were mourning not just a king, but the end of an era when heroes seemed larger than life, and victory over evil appeared achievable through individual courage and determination. The poem's conclusion, with its somber recognition that even the greatest heroes must eventually succumb to mortality and that the communities they protect must find ways to survive without them, speaks to universal truths about leadership, sacrifice, and the cyclical nature of human civilization. Beowulf's story reminds us that heroism is not a permanent solution to the world's problems, but a temporary bulwark against chaos and evil that must be renewed by each generation according to its own circumstances and challenges. The treasure that had cost so many lives to guard, steal, and recover became a symbol of the complex relationship between individual achievement and collective welfare. Gold and jewels could provide resources for defense and prosperity, but they could also attract enemies and corrupt those who possess them if they forgot that wealth, like strength and courage, was meant to serve purposes larger than mere accumulation or personal aggrandizement. In the end, Beowulf's greatest treasure was not the dragon's gold, but the example he had set for future generations. The demonstration that ordinary human beings, through extraordinary dedication to duty and service, could rise to meet whatever challenges their times demanded of them. His legacy lived not in the barrow that marked his grave, but in the hearts and minds of those who heard his story and found in it inspiration to face their own monsters, whether literal or metaphorical, with courage, honor, and unwavering commitment to protecting those who depended upon them. The Anglo-Saxon world that produced this epic understood that heroes were not born, but made, forged in the crucible of difficult choices and impossible challenges, shaped by the decision to place duty before personal safety and service before self-interest. Beowulf's story became their template for what human beings could achieve when they dedicated themselves to ideals worthy of the ultimate sacrifice. And it remains our template today for understanding what true heroism means in any age or culture. As we close this journey through one of literature's greatest adventures, remember that you carry within yourself the same potential for heroism that Beowulf embodied. The monsters may be different, perhaps their injustice, ignorance, hatred, or despair rather than Grendel, his mother, and a dragon, but the choice to fight them remains the same. In your daily life, in your community, in your small corner of the world, you have opportunities to serve something larger than yourself, to protect those who need protection, and to leave behind a legacy that inspires others to continue the eternal struggle between good and evil. That's the real treasure Beowulf offers us. Not gold or glory, but the understanding that heroism is available to anyone willing to pay its price. and that the battles we fight for justice, compassion, and truth are worthy of whatever they cost us. The age of heroes isn't finished. It continues with every person who chooses to stand up for what's right, regardless of the odds or the consequences. Thank you for joining this epic journey through the ultimate hero's story. Like and subscribe if you want to explore more timeless tales that show us the best of what humanity can achieve. And remember, somewhere out there, your own heroic moment is waiting. The question is, will you be ready when it comes?